Hey everyone, this is Kevin from the chesswebsite.com. Today we're going to be looking at Game 3 from the 2014 World Chess Championship. Game 1 was a draw. Vishy Anand playing the white pieces. In Game 2, Magnus Carlsen came out with the white pieces and put on a beautiful display to actually win the game. So going into game number 3 with 10 matches left, Vishy Anand definitely looking for a spark so that he doesn't fall too far behind the defending champion Magnus Carlsen. So in game number 3, we have Vishy Anand playing the white pieces, Magnus Carlsen playing the black pieces. And we get started with the pretty common d4 from Vishy Anand. This has been pretty much his go-to opening. And Magnus Carlsen decides for kind of the traditional Queen's Gambit decline line. So knight to c3, bishop here to e7, bishop to f4. Again, this is just kind of the main line. Pawn to e3, knight here to d7, and then pawn pushing forward here to c5. Now, Vishy Anand did have a few different options, a few different ways he could have continued. Queen to c2 is fairly common. Another one would be bishop here to e2. It's usually met by pawn taking here on c4, and then the bishop taking here on c4, kind of losing a move by moving it twice, but now controlling the center of the board. But Vishy Anand decided for a little bit of an aggressive approach on the queen side with pawn here to c5. And then we see Magnus Carlsen responding with pawn here to c6. So kind of a semi-Slav approach to his pawn structure and opening with his knights here. This light square bishop is not outside the pawn chain. So a very solid defense from Magnus Carlsen, looking to control the light squares in the center of the board and then maybe counter specifically on the queen side later into the game. Vishy Anand, again, playing a pretty solid Queen's Gambit decline line for white, trying to put a little bit more pressure on the queen side, knowing that his opponent usually likes to counter on that side. Bishop to d3, continuing with Anand's development, getting ready to castle on the king side. Pawn to b6, as we talked about, Carlsen really doesn't have a way to continue on the king side. Anand has the majority of the material and power over here, so the queen side's really the logical place, especially in sort of that semi-Slav variation. Attacking on the queen side is usually what you see. Pawn to b4, so Vishy Anand's ready to counterattack. And then we see both sides just really trying to win the dominance of the queen side pawn structure. So pawn here to a3, bishop here to a6, getting this light square bishop involved into the game as much as possible. After the bishop takes, the rook takes here on a6, and then a pretty interesting move I thought from Vishy Anand. Usually if I look at this, a few moves, I see queen here to d3, finishing up the development here. Usually not going to castle on the queen side, obviously, because there's just too much pressure, but castling on the king side, you have a very active queen right here. Even queen here to e2, still controlling this long light square diagonal, attacking this rook, kind of forcing it to move. Instead, Vishy Anand went for a different approach, and he played pawn here to b5, which I didn't see initially, but it makes sense as we kind of continue. The pawn takes here on b5, and instead of even taking with the knight, Vishy Anand starts to push forward. So his goal is to try to really maintain control of this c file and add a lot of pressure with this passed pawn. So the queen's going to come to c8. So if the pawn takes here on d7, then the knight's just going to fall here on c3. It's going to be very hard for Vishy Anand to hold on to this pawn here on the d file since he can't really get any pieces behind it. So instead, first plays pawn here to c7, and that is, again, has some defense with this bishop here on f4. So after the pawn pushes forward, now the knight's going to come to a5, and all of a sudden, Vishy Anand has a lot of pressure building on the square here on c7, so kind of hampering Magnus Carlsen's ability to kind of get all of his pieces developed into the game. He really wants an active queen. His rook over here is kind of stuck, and all of a sudden he's opening up the door. He can castle on the king side, get his rook involved if he wants to add more pressure on the c file. This is a great knight right here. It can't be chased away by chased away by his opponent's bishop. So things right now looking pretty good for Vishy Anand. Just continue to put pressure on his opponent, which we haven't seen, so far in this championship. And even dating back to last championship when Vishy Anand played Magnus Carlsen, it always felt like the youngster Magnus Carlsen was the one putting a lot of pressure, even as the black pieces. But so far in this opening, Vishy Anand recognizing that he needs to push for the win and playing an aggressive opening. And Magnus Carlsen's taking a lot of time for all of his moves because he's not really sure. He doesn't want to make a mistake and give up any advantage to Vishy Anand. Magnus Carlsen now plays a pawn to a5, rook to c1, trying to add another defender to the square on c7. Also wants to alleviate the pressure of this knight on b5 to protect this pawn. Now this knight's actually able to defend this square here on d6, which could potentially become very, very valuable. We now see knight to e4 here, a very important move for Magnus Carlsen to make sure that he controls the square here on d6. If he tried something else, pawn taking here on a3, then all of a sudden bishop to d6 becomes very, very challenging for Magnus Carlsen to deal with. If he wanted to, take away this knight because it's protecting it, rook to a5 could be a thing, but then the bishop just takes, and then the rook takes, and the bishop takes here on f8. All of a sudden, Magnus Carlsen is up in material. It's going to be very, very difficult for black to win this game or even draw this game. If instead Magnus Carlsen takes, then this knight can take here on d6. Again, black doesn't have his knight here on e4 to protect this. This is now attacking the queen, forcing it to move. And now this rook here on c1 and the knight both are protecting this square here on c8 for this pawn to push forward for promotion. So that's definitely going to be very, very bad. Magnus Carlsen in the game found the best move, and that is knight to e4. Nice central outpost for this knight, controlling some of the critical squares here on d6. And then we see knight to g5. And what's interesting is a game, if you go back about 2 months ago in a big tournament, a tournament that Vishy Anand was at, Levon Aronian actually played this game. And in this game, he played knight to g5. So kind of no surprise. Both of these players have seconds. It's kind of their teammates that kind of help them prepare. So they're familiar with a lot of, especially the recent tournaments and the big games. And so knowing that, Vishy Anand just kind of played the knight to g5. This is what had been played in the past, so he hasn't really gotten out of line from here. But Magnus Carlsen took over 30 minutes to respond to this move, which is kind of crazy because, Magnus Carlsen has to, at least his team has seen this game. They're familiar with it, so they kind of know the response from that. But he took over 30 minutes for his response, and his response was knight to f6. Now, Susan Polgar said, okay, maybe he thought that Vishy Anand may try something else, maybe knight to d2. Not exactly sure why he thought he may play that, since knight to g5 probably is the better move. Magnus Carlsen, even from here, does have a few options himself. He could have just tried to take with his knight here on a g5, but then again, this bishop here to d6 becomes very, very challenging for Magnus Carlsen to deal with. He could still try the same stuff with, the rook coming down here, but then the bishop taking the exchange. It's going to be very difficult to continue. So another option he could have tried, instead of the knight taking on g6, he could have tried taking with his bishop, so bishop taking here on g5. But then after the bishop takes here on g5, we're going to see very similar stuff. The rook coming down here to a5, the pawn taking here, and then now the queen to a5. So a lot of pressure from Vishy Anand in this particular situation, and it's going to be very, very difficult for Magnus Carlsen to hold on. So he did find the best move, but it's interesting because in the game Levon Aronian played, black played knight to f6. It wasn't some crazy find that hadn't been played. This was exactly how the game continued. It was interesting that Magnus Carlsen took so long in the game. So 30 plus minutes to find this move. And kind of funny and ironic is after this move of 30 some odd minutes, Vishy Anand just immediately snap played knight takes on e4, which it always kind of stinks when you take a really, really long time and you feel like you find the best move, and as soon as you play, your opponent just immediately plays plays, and it's right back on the clock for you. You're already down about 40 minutes on board, and it just kind of stinks. I know Magnus Carlsen was probably hoping for a little bit more time to kind of prepare for his next move, but he didn't. He decided to go ahead and play knight taking here on e4, which again probably is the best move. He could have tried something with, his pawn taking here, but wanted to kind of keep the pawn structure available in the center of the board to control the light squares. So taking here on e4 makes sense. And then the pawn pushing forward here with f3, and then the rook to a5. Now, what's interesting here is in the particular game, everything is pretty much the same, but white in the Levon Aronian game a couple months ago, it was queen to e2. And this is important because in the game, white ended up drawing. And queen to e2 probably is not the best move in this match, and instead, Vishy Anand and his team of seconds, came up with a better move, and they thought that f taking here on f4, on e4, is much better, and I would agree. I think it's much more aggressive. It allows this queen to do other stuff instead of trying to control, the square here on e2. It still is more active, controlling the square here on a4, and also just taking this knight that has a nice little outpost. That makes a lot of sense. Vishy Anand can now castle on the king side. He has a semi-open file for his rook here, so that's going to be very aggressive. So all in all, I think this is just much better, and Vishy Anand said that he had kind of prepared for this specific spot right here. So he had found a little nuance that he thought was an improvement, and he went for it. And so far, he's putting a lot of pressure on his opponent. Magnus Carlsen just kind of sitting back. His queen and his rook aren't doing too much. They're kind of just playing defense. And even if we go back to last year's World Championship, Magnus Carlsen really has been the one putting a lot of pressure on his opponent. Vishy Anand has just been kind of intimidated almost from the young Norwegian. But in this particular match so far, Vishy Anand putting all the pressure on his opponent and finding all the right moves. Now the rook's going to take here on a b5. Again, kind of an exchange of the pieces on board. The queen takes here on a4. Again, that little subtlety of controlling the square is a little bit better, I think. Rook to a5. Now the queen to c6. And all of a sudden, Vishy Anand is adding more and more pressure to this c file right here, allowing himself to control with this pawn here on c7. Magnus Carlsen just always has to be thinking about this pawn pushing forward. So his queen is just kind of handicapped right now. The pawn takes here on a3, so Magnus Carlsen does have a push pawn. This could come into play later on if Vishy Anand slips up, which so far up until this point, Vishy Anand towards the end of the game, he just gets grinded down and he tends to make a mistake. So Magnus Carlsen wants to make sure, if nothing else, if he doesn't get a draw, maybe he can force his opponent to a mistake and come up with a win, and that would be huge for Magnus Carlsen. Now the pawn's going to take here on d5. Now the rook's going to swing over here to d5. Queen to b6. Queen to d7, opening up the door for the rook to come over here to c8. Needs to add more pressure and defense to that square in c7. Castling on the king side safety, but more important, allowing this rook to get involved more into the action. Rook over here to c8. Again, all these are pretty straightforward. Rook to c6 wants to get it more involved, but also wants to open up the door for the other rook to come over here to c5. And now pawn to g5. Magnus Carlsen trying to find some sort of counterplay. All his pieces are just trying to play defense over here. So g5 really possibly the only move he has as far as counterplay. He could play pawn here to a2, but he just can't really defend it with his pieces because they're kind of tied up right now. So keeping it on a3, since it is somewhat defended by his bishop here on e7, makes sense. Magnus Carlsen just doesn't have a whole lot of options on this board state. So the bishop just comes back here to g3, still maintaining that pressure and control of the c7 square. Bishop here to b4, the rook over here to a1, attacking this pawn. And then we see bishop coming back here to a5. Somewhat a mistake from Magnus Carlsen. The queen could just come here to a6. He's going to lose his momentum with that he had over here with his pawn, but he decided, hey, it's better to go ahead and take this pawn off the board so I don't have to deal with it, but it just puts him in a tougher spot. The queen comes back here to c4. There's no real way to kind of hold control of this pawn here on a3. Bishop takes here on a5. After the rook takes, we do see an exchange off the board. Pawn pushing forward here to e6. The king coming over here to f8. And then the rook over here to a c1, and all of a sudden, Vishy Anand just has too much pressure on the C-file. There's no way for Magnus Carlsen to defend all of this. Maybe if he had his king over here, he had one extra defender, but he doesn't. And Vishy Anand wins in this particular match. In this particular setup, Magnus Carlsen was forced to resign. He only had about 30-something seconds left, but towards the end of the match, he just didn't have much time, and so he was pretty much playing a blitz game at the end. He was just kind of forcing his moves, making small incremental errors. Vishy Anand had tons of time. He was definitely the more prepared player. If you kind of talk to both players afterwards, they interviewed him. Vishy Anand said for this particular game in the Queen's Gambit decline line, he had been preparing for a very long time and was very prepared. Magnus Carlsen, it didn't seem like he was super prepared. He was actually caught off guard by how prepared Vishy Anand was, how fast he was moving. He was used to putting pressure on his opponent, and he said he just didn't have that ability in this game. So Vishy Anand, amazing game to go ahead and take this victory. We haven't seen him really do this to Magnus Carlsen in a very long time. So all of a sudden, things get interesting. Both players have a draw. Both players have a win. We come back tomorrow. Magnus Carlsen takes on the white pieces, trying to get back on track to defend his title. But all things square right now after 3 games. Super excited about this series. Really, really proud of Vishy Anand for coming out and securing a very, very needed win. So hopefully you guys enjoyed the series. I think this was probably the best match so far of the series. So hopefully you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Thanks for watching.